Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some San Jose Sharks news, and primarily that today was the deadline around the league for teams to send qualifying offers to their restricted free agents. Any player who did not get a qualifying offer gets released to unrestricted free agency and are unlikely to be back with their respective teams. And there were multiple RFAs on the roster for the Sharks, yet only a couple actually ended up getting qualifying offers. But before we get to that, there is a bit of other Sharks news to discuss today. A couple of signings announced by Noah Gregor and the organization. The first one being Makiniemi, goaltending prospect who was originally acquired last offseason in the Brent Burns trade from the Carolina Hurricanes. Had a couple of very short stints with the San Jose Sharks this season. Looked pretty decent, or at least good enough, and it seems as though maybe because he was specifically targeted in that Carolina Hurricanes trade, that the Sharks want him to likely be the number one goaltender in the AHL for the San Jose Barracuda next season. And as you'll see, there was a bit of a culling of the rest of the Sharks goaltending prospect pool. We'll see later on Strauss-Mann did not get a qualifying offer, but also a couple of weeks ago it was announced that Ben Goodrow would not be getting a contract, and he would actually end up re-entering the draft for the 2023. So generally, the Sharks trying to thin out that pool and narrow it down to the goaltenders that they really want to, at the very least, hopefully be the future of Sharks goaltending. And the next signing would be Jacob Peterson. I predicted that he would obviously get re-signed, and I thought he might end up with a Barabanov type of contract, 1 year, $1 million. But one important detail that I didn't remember is that Jacob Peterson was a restricted free agent, while Barabanov at the time a few years ago was an unrestricted free agent, meaning Barabanov had more freedom to go elsewhere, so the Sharks perhaps needed to include a sweetener there. When it comes to Jacob Peterson, the Sharks retain his rights, and so not as much of a sweetener necessary to keep him on the Sharks roster. And so a 1 year league minimum, which is now $775,000 going into the 23-24 season, and it is also notably a two-way deal. So it's very interesting because if things do not work out, Peterson cannot sustain the type of performance he had at the end of last season with the Sharks. He could very well easily be sent down to the Barracuda. Now moving on to the actual meat of this video, we have the restricted free agents who were given qualifying offers. And the first one is Fabian Zetterlund. And what is interesting about this qualifying offer is that we were evaluating purely based on performance with the San Jose Sharks last season. Out of all of the RFAs that the Sharks had, Zetterlund was probably least deserving of a qualifying offer. He was just absolutely invisible and just kind of bad with the Sharks in the stint of games that he played last season. But of course, he was targeted in that Timo Meier deal. He was brought over from New Jersey to San Jose because he was, doing pretty well in New Jersey, and Greer was hoping that could continue in San Jose. And while it didn't, it's a very, very bad look to not end up giving him a qualifying offer. And so while he's not particularly deserving of it, based on his Sharks performance, he will almost certainly be back next season. The other restricted free agent who did get a qualifying offer, maybe a bit of a dark horse. Obviously, Martin Kaut was also acquired in a trade last season, that one in the Ryan Merkley-Matt Nieto trade in exchange for Jacob McDonald and Martin Kaut. So you could say, oh, is it a bad look if Kaut didn't get a qualifying offer? I don't necessarily think so, because of the fact that it also came with McDonald, and I don't think Kaut was necessarily a big part. And as we heard earlier on today, Ryan Merkley didn't even get a qualifying offer from Colorado. And so generally, Kaut definitely could have fallen through the cracks, but it seems as though in the small amount of games that he played with the Sharks this past season, he did enough to get Greer interested in giving him that qualifying offer. But that will make it the only two restricted free agents who will be kept under Sharks control going into this free agency period. Multiple others were let go. So in the unrestricted free agency class now, we have a couple of names that are not necessarily obvious, but unsurprising to see them here, both Gadjevich and Svechnikov. In my free agency preview video, I mentioned how both of these players theoretically could be back with the San Jose Sharks, but likely shouldn't be. Pretty replaceable, and while they had some okay moments with the Sharks, in particular Svechnikov honestly had some pretty decent games with the Sharks this past season, neither of them are anything remotely important and aren't all that great either, so easily could just be replaced with other players either through free agency or within the organization. So again, not really a huge loss for San Jose. Another restricted free agent who becomes now an unrestricted free agent, like I mentioned earlier, is Strauss Mann. Apparently did not show the organization enough to set him up with a future for the San Jose Sharks, and with the semi-recent signing of Romanov, another goaltending prospect, it perhaps made Mann a bit more expendable, and as such, he is becoming that unrestricted free agent. The next two names are probably the big ones here, and the more surprising ones, though perhaps not, or perhaps at least one of them should not be. The first being here, Mackenzie Blackwood was just acquired a couple of days ago from the New Jersey Devils in exchange for a 6th round pick, and people might see this and say, why did the Sharks give up a 6th round pick to not then give him a qualifying offer? Well, it should be noted that Blackwood was on a relatively hefty contract, meaning a qualifying offer actually would have been over $3 million had he taken that, and Blackwood's performance over these past couple of years has nowhere near the worth of over $3 million. And so what is actually going to be happening, and this is confirmed by sort of a lot of insiders, is that while he's not getting a qualifying offer, because indeed the Sharks don't want to pay him that type of money, they are working out a contract anyway to keep him in San Jose, going to obviously come in lower than what his qualifying offer would have been. It's kind of similar to with Timo Meier, where you're not giving him that, the Devils didn't give him that qualifying offer of $10 million for 1 year. They just sort of re-signed him at $8 million, or at $8.8 million for 8 years. So I suspect that sooner, very, very soon, perhaps by the end of today or tomorrow, or perhaps like in a couple of days, we'll see a contract for Blackwood, and that will likely come in at around like the $2 million, perhaps even less than that mark. But the final name here is one that is rather surprising, and that is Noah Gregor. Now, when originally Mike Grier came to the San Jose Sharks, took over at last offseason, while many of the bigger names were obviously safe, not much is going to be happening with Couture, Vlasic, Hurdle, these types of players, a lot of these smaller names on the San Jose Sharks were not particularly safe to Mike Grier's cleaning house. There was the fact that Jonathan Dahlen didn't get a qualifying offer. There was the fact that Rudolph Balcers got bought out. But Noah Gregor was a player who actually was kept on the roster, was given a qualifying offer, and likely as a last chance type of situation. And it seems as though he was not impressive enough this season to be kept by the Sharks once more, and this is somewhat disappointing. And Gregor's story honestly reminds me a bit of another NHL player from a few years ago by the name of Paul Byron. For those who may not be familiar with Paul Byron's story, he was an okay player with the Calgary Flames a few years ago, but couldn't really find a home on that team and was eventually put on waivers. But around that same time, a Calgary Flames fan made a YouTube video showing a clip of multiple breakaways and great chances that Paul Byron had that he would not actually end up scoring on, showing them that he was relatively unlucky or perhaps snake bitten or something like that. And Montreal Canadiens front office people saw this video and used it as evidence for why they should pick up Paul Byron, and Byron ended up being a lot less snake bitten with the Montreal Canadiens and even became a 20-goal scorer for them for a couple of years. Now, I'm not saying that Noah Gregor is going to follow this exact same trajectory, but if you were thinking that talking about a player who constantly gets breakaways and odd man rushes and isn't able to bury on them sounds familiar, that's because Noah Gregor was doing that constantly, not just this season, but for the past couple of years. And so since this is likely the Sharks moving on from Noah Gregor, since his qualifying offer really wouldn't have been all that much to pay him, and considering I know Gregor was not particularly happy with the amount of healthy scratches he received this past season, so I imagine he'll go elsewhere, this could end up being a similar situation for San Jose, where they move on from a player who was downright unlucky at times this season, and it ends up sort of biting them a bit. And sure, I'm not saying Gregor's going to become a 60-point, 30-goal scorer type of player, but a 15-goal scorer, it really wouldn't be all that surprising. And the fact is that if the Sharks were actually looking to be competitive next season, I could understand moving off from Gregor and trying to find someone who in the immediate short term here and now is better. But considering the Sharks are not looking to be competitive next season, what is likely going to happen is that Gregor's roster spot is going to be taken up by some random veteran that Mike Grier is going to sign in free agency. And look, I understand the value of these veteran types of players, not only just in the locker room, so to speak, but also the business type where you can get to the trade deadline and then trade a veteran for like a 6th round pick. But what are the odds of that, let's say, 6th round pick then becoming a player like Gregor who could potentially score 15 goals? Not exactly super high. So I personally would have stuck with Noah Gregor for this one. I think that there was, a bit of good luck coming his way, could definitely have made him at least a pretty good third liner. But them's the breaks, the San Jose Sharks. It's not a massive loss necessarily, and we'll see if exactly it ends up being the correct choice. Class dismissed.